It's Wednesday, September 25th, 2024, and we are 40 days from the election. Welcome to today's Make It Make Sense mini-episode. I'm Grant Herms. Today on the show, President Joe Biden takes one last turn on the world stage during his final speech to the United Nations General Assembly amid two globally captivating wars and what might be the beginning of a third. So President Biden spoke to the UN General Assembly in New York yesterday, the annual speech that all American presidents give. He spoke for about 25 minutes or so, and he focused on three key ideas: peace, climate change, and artificial intelligence. It was also very much a speech about setting his legacy in world history. Now, this was not a blow the doors off the building, shake the green marble of the UN kind of a speech. Biden just doesn't have that in him anymore, but it was one of these things where he talked about his long history in public service and what he wanted to try to bring to the table for the U.S. when it comes to being a global partner. He talked about the long history of American conflicts and wars since he was in public life, and he talked about being responsible in part for ending the war in Iraq while he was vice president, and the end of the war in Afghanistan, where he honored the lives lost, both military and civilian, in the evacuation, which was an interesting thing for him to focus on because that was 3 years ago now. He's talked about it before, and it's been a frequent point of criticism for Republicans against Biden and now Harris. Take a listen to what he had to say.
And we did, painful as it was. When I came to office as president, Afghanistan had replaced Vietnam as America's longest war. I was determined to end it, and I did. It was a hard decision, but the right decision. 4 American presidents had faced that decision, but I was determined not to leave it to the 5th. It was a decision accompanied by tragedy. 13 brave Americans lost their lives, along with hundreds of Afghans in a suicide bomb. I think those lost lives, I think of them every day. I think of all the 2,461 U.S. military deaths over a long 20 years of that war. 20,744 American servicemen wounded in action. I think of their service, their sacrifice, and their heroism. I know other countries lost their own men and women fighting alongside us. We honor their sacrifices as well.
So what struck me there was that Biden didn't blame Trump, which he normally has in the past when it comes to the Afghan withdrawal. I've talked about this before, but experts agree that yes, Trump left the Biden administration with a very flawed exit deal and plan, but the Biden administration was slow to ramp up evacuation efforts in the months and weeks before the end of the war. Biden also talked about the war in Ukraine, which he wants to see an end to along with the rest of NATO, but also he said that he's wanted to see it as a symbol to end wars started by dictators invading sovereign UN nations. Ukraine was one of the founding members of the UN in 1945. It was then a part of the Soviet Union, which I think is just worth pointing out. Biden also urged the world not to lose focus or attention on the war. I also want to say that I'll be using more clips of Biden in this mini than I normally would because he is the president of the United States speaking on our behalf to literally the world, and you should hear the direct quote of what he's saying. So anyway, here is what Biden's call to action on Ukraine sounded like.
Putin's war has failed, and at his core aim. He set out to destroy Ukraine, but Ukraine is still free. He set out to weaken NATO, but NATO is bigger, stronger, and more united than ever before, with 2 new members, Finland and Sweden. But we cannot let up. The world now has another choice to make. Will we sustain our support to help Ukraine win this war and preserve its freedom, or walk away and let aggression be renewed and a nation be destroyed? I know my answer. We cannot grow weary. We cannot look away. And we will not let up on our support for Ukraine, not until Ukraine wins a just and durable peace in the UN Charter.
Now, it's been reported that Biden is going to present a plan to end the war in Ukraine with actual figures and timelines and proposals this week in meetings at the Assembly. We're still waiting to see what the full plan of that is. But it's worth keeping an eye out for when it does get announced, because Biden really wants part of his legacy to be ending a war while he's president. At least a war where the United States is able to broker peace and wasn't actively involved in the fighting like we were in Afghanistan. He sees that as a marker of commitment to U.S. troops and foreign service members, that he is a president and a man committed to honoring their sacrifices by trying to use his leadership to find peace. And he also sees it as a reflection of the kind of president that he was elected to be, somebody who was elected to restore American alliances and confidence in American leadership across the world, not just leading through military power, but also diplomatic power. He also used this speech as a rallying cry to allies at the UN to stay the course in Ukraine, which was a not-so-subtle nod to the fact that the world could see another Trump presidency, and U.S. allies have been worried about a second, less constrained Donald Trump in office and what that might mean for global stability. Trump, as recent as this week at a rally in Georgia, criticized the Biden administration for continuing to help fund Ukraine's defense. He praised the Russian military, and he's long had a grudge against Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky after Trump was impeached for trying to strong-arm Zelensky into digging up non-existent dirt on Hunter Biden. And J.D. Vance has also called for an end to the war by Ukraine ceding land back to Russia and just giving up the fight. So it's not so hard to see why some global leaders and allies might be concerned about having Trump back in office, so much so that, in fact, NATO allies have been working to try and Trump-proof that very important global alliance ahead of this election. But let's get back to Biden here. It was about here that Biden turned to Israel, and frankly, he pulled his punches. There's no way around it. Take a listen.
The world must not flinch from the horrors of October 7th. Any country would have the right and responsibility to ensure that such an attack can never happen again. Thousands of armed Hamas terrorists invaded a sovereign state, slaughtering and massacring more than 1,200 people, including 46 Americans, in their homes and at a music festival. Despicable acts of sexual violence, 250 innocents taken hostage. I've met with the families of those hostages. I've grieved with them. They're going through hell. Innocent civilians in Gaza are also going through hell. Thousands and thousands killed, including aid workers. Too many families dislocated, crowding into tents, facing a dire humanitarian situation. They didn't ask for this war that Hamas started. I put forward with Qatar and Egypt a ceasefire and hostage deal. It's been endorsed by the UN Security Council. Now is the time for the parties to finalize its terms, bring the hostages home, and secure security for Israel and Gaza free of Hamas' grip, ease the suffering in Gaza, and end this war. On October 7th.
So Biden said that as it was being reported that he and Netanyahu, the prime minister of Israel, who's in town this week for the assembly, have no public plans to meet or private plans to meet about ending the war in Gaza and reaching a hostage deal or preventing what now seems like an inevitable war in Lebanon. It also comes as there's been some new reporting from Haaretz, the New York Times or Washington Post of Israel, saying that Netanyahu has been both actively torpedoing hostage negotiations and has vowed to pause those talks for the next 45 days as the American election plays out. Haaretz also reported that Netanyahu has a vested interest, both personally for prolonging the negotiations, given his criminal trial is set to start in just a couple months, so if there's an ongoing war, or wars, plural, they might extend when those trials would start because he has to lead a nation at war. He's also got an interest in harming Kamala Harris politically by not reaching an end to the war in Gaza or a hostage deal, knowing that Trump will be much more favorable to his ongoing war efforts. Still, Biden said there was a peaceful path forward when it came to both the war in Gaza, where he called for a two-state solution, and a peaceful pre-solution in Lebanon. Now, today, multiple news organizations have said that IDF sources are saying that Israel is preparing for a ground invasion into Lebanon, risking destabilizing the region even further and risking Iran getting into the war because it backs the terror group Hezbollah, which is operated out of Lebanon. Now, Biden also talked about the civil war and humanitarian crisis in Sudan, where millions of people have been displaced and are starving as warring generals continue their fight. He pleaded with members of the UN to stop arming those generals and to get them to come to the table to find a peaceful solution. Biden then moved on to climate change, which was the middle section of the speech, and it was frankly a little tough to follow, to be honest. It just didn't seem as pointed or as fleshed out as other portions of the speech. Now, that could have been for a lot of reasons, like he didn't want to hamstring Kamala Harris into having to answer a bunch of questions about what a Biden-Harris climate change continuation might look like. Or it could have been that for a long time now, developing nations have felt that it's pretty unfair for developed nations who used dirty energy and fossil fuels to become developed nations to tell them that they can't use that energy and must use more expensive, cleaner energy to become developed nations. It's a tightrope walk that the international community has done for decades now. Or honestly, it could have just been that I watched this on the elliptical this morning, and this is at about the 15-minute mark of his speech, and I was beginning to feel a little lightheaded. Either way, it just wasn't as attention-grabby. But Biden highlighted the successes of his administration and called for more work to be done with those developing nations to curb emissions. He also talked about bringing new voices to the UN when it comes specifically to climate change. The last member was South Sudan in 2011. That was the last member inducted into the UN, and the world has changed a lot since then. So here's what Biden said.
To keep it going, I want to get things done together. In order to do that, we must build a stronger, more effective, and more inclusive United Nations. The UN needs to adapt and bring new voices and new perspectives. That's why we support reforming and expanding the membership of the UN Security Council. My UN ambassador just laid out our detailed vision to reflect today's world, not yesterday's. It's time to move forward. The Security Council, like the UN itself, needs to go back to the job of making peace, of brokering deals to end wars and suffering.
This was also a bit about his legacy again in terms of how President Biden will be remembered in the global memory, again, as an American president coming off a once-in-a-century pandemic into a time of global economic, military, and democratic instability in key parts of the world. He wants to be seen as somebody who advocated for peace. Biden also talked about AI too, which I was sort of struck by, not because it's not an issue, but because he chose to make it a major issue in his farewell address as president to the UN. Here's what he said.
No one knows all the answers. My fellow leaders, it's with humility I offer two questions. First, how do we as an international community govern AI? As countries and companies race to uncertain frontiers, we need an equally urgent effort to ensure AI's safety, security, and trustworthiness. As AI grows more powerful, it must grow also must grow more responsive to our collective needs and values. Benefits of all must be shared equitably. It should be harnessed to narrow, not deepen digital divides. Second, will we ensure that AI supports rather than undermines the core principles that human life has value and all humans deserve dignity? We must make certain that the awesome capabilities of AI will be used to uplift and empower everyday people, not to give dictators more powerful shackles on the human spirit. In the years ahead, there may well be no greater test of our leadership than how we deal with AI.
So for him to call AI one of the greatest tests of global leadership is no small thing. And for those of you watching this on YouTube, I have no idea if the ambassador from South Korea was asleep there during that cutaway or not, but likely they did cut to South Korea because the nation is a major player when it comes to AI, given its deep tech and gaming culture. It's also the first major nation to have a wave of really harmful deepfake porn of students to be spread across hundreds of schools, which is something that AI experts have been warning about for years now as a real possibility with this technology. But it's the first epidemic of its kind that we've seen, and it's happening right now. But back to Biden here. He ended his speech with a call for a renewal to democracy and democratic principles worldwide, which was interesting because there are more than a few members of the UN who are from autocratic or dictatorial nations, Russia, China, Chile, Iran, all included in that list. And today the floor was given to more than a few of those autocratic leaders who spoke to the UN, and even a few went out of their way to undermine Biden specifically. But Biden also had a call to leaders echoing his reasoning for dropping out of the race for president, calling on leaders to put their people, not their pride, first.
As much as I love the job, I love my country more. I decided after 50 years of public service, it's time for a new generation of leadership to take my nation forward. My fellow leaders, let us never forget, some things are more important than staying in power. It's your people. It's your people that matter the most. Never forget, we are here to serve the people.
So obviously, that's what we've heard from Biden before. But for him to say it on the world stage to a bunch of other nations wasn't a step over a line, but maybe a little closer to something out of step of how leaders usually address the UN. They don't want to appear personal or like they're giving outright directions or telling others how to run their countries explicitly, but Biden veered into that a little bit here. He also gets a little leeway because it is his last address as a leader, and he also gets a lot of leeway because he's the American president, but it was still striking to leave the podium that way nonetheless. Okay, speaking of leaving, that is it for today's MIMS Mini. Thank you so much for listening today. Please rate and review the show on whatever podcast you've got. It really helps boost the show into other people's feeds. Also, like and subscribe this page. That also helps boost the show. You can also subscribe to the Make It Make Sense Substack. I've got a great interview coming this Friday in the full episode, and I have no doubt that the extended version of that interview is something you're definitely going to want to listen to. So subscribe now so you don't miss out on that this weekend. And also, continue to share the show on social media. It's at MIMS News Pod. That's MIMS News Pod, all one word on every platform. I am at Grant Herms on X and at Grant Herms TV on everything else. Thank you so much for listening. I'm Grant Herms, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.